Hello, my name is Robel Gaither and welcome to my first pattern tutorial. So yes, the time has finally come. I am now going to start offering and selling digital patterns. So this is my first ever tutorial for my first ever pattern, and this one is a really in-depth tutorial. With my patterns, I really want to make tutorials that are in-depth, that show you every step of the way and explain everything thoroughly through. I didn't really speed through it. I really take my time to explain because I want you guys to understand how to construct this wallet for this pattern. So I'm gonna go ahead and show the wallet that's for this tutorial. So let's do that. So this is the wallet that I teach you how to make and that the digital pattern is for. It is really cute and small. It is called the SPW, this money pouch wallet. And I made this before on my channel. You might have seen the video, but it features a card slot in the front, the center compartment. It has a magnetic snap closure, if I could close it. And then it has a card slot on the back that you can also fit some cards in. So it's a really nice size. I love it. It's really fun to make, really simple, and nothing too crazy as well. So not only am I now going to be offering digital patterns, but I'm going to be offering courses. So my first ever course is now up and available on my website, and I teach you how to make your own pattern to this wallet. Because I get a lot of questions and inquiries of people who are like, oh, can you teach how to make patterns? I'm only able to make bags based off patterns that other people make and sell and stuff like that. So I really wanted to dabble into the world of teaching people how to make their own patterns. So if you are interested in that, the link to the pattern and the course is down below in the description box, so you can purchase both or you can purchase one or the other. But yeah, it's a really in-depth course on how to make the pattern for this as well. I'm really excited. This is my first ever pattern. I've been really nervous about going into this because I've never made a digital pattern before in my life. Every bag that I've ever made the pattern for it, I drafted myself by hand. I've never used Adobe Illustrator or anything like that. So this was really a new learning curve for me. And this video is really in depth. So I am gonna have parts of this video timestamped if you wanna skip certain parts and just learn how to do certain pieces and elements like that. So make sure you check that out if that's a feature that you wanna do. And yeah, so again, this is the wallet that we're going to be learning how to make today. Please stick around and learn how to make it if you purchase this. And if you are interested, again, the links to both the course and this pattern are down below in the description box. And let's get into the tutorial. All right, so the first thing I'm going to be going over is some of the basic materials that we're going to be needing. So some of these are optional. The first one being this cutting mat. This is optional. You don't have to use this. This is for if you're going to be using a rotary cutter. And then of course you're going to be needing some cutting utensils. So this is a rotary cutter, again, optional. Scissors that I use to cut paper, and then my fabric scissors, which I use to cut my fabric. You want to make sure you use separate scissors for separate parts of your project. And then this is a chalk pencil. I love this thing. You can use tailoring chalk if you have that, but I use this mechanical chalk pencil. It's by Fonts and Porter. I love this so much. I use it. And then I'm using a pointed stiletto. This is what I'm going to use to help me guide the fabric and things like that. It's optional. You don't have to use it, but it does make it easier. A bone folder, and then again, this is optional, but it will make certain parts smoother. Double-sided tape. So this is 1/8 inch double-sided tape. This is what I'm going to be using on certain parts. Again, it's optional. You don't have to. And another thing that's optional but will make your life a lot easier, and I will show you when the time comes, is staples. I love using staples in my projects. It helps a lot, so I will go over later what I'll be using that for. And then of course some quilting clips. So these are what we're going to be using to, you know, hold our fabric together. I like using this. It's just a lot easier. So these are our basic materials, and now I'm going to go over what we're going to need to actually construct this piece. Okay, so the first thing we're going to need is our base fabric or exterior fabric, whatever fabric we're going to be using for our exterior. I'm using a denim. I want to say this is a 10-ounce denim, which for this project, I really recommend sticking between 10, 12, and 14 ounce for canvas or denim if that's what you're going to be using. If you're a beginner, I recommend going with 10 to 12 because it's a little bit easier to work with. So this is what I'm using for my exterior, and then this is what I'm using for my interior. This is a waterproof canvas. I love using this for my linings. One, because it's waterproof, and then two, it's just really durable and it holds up nicely. And then for interfacing, I'm going to be using a woven cotton interfacing. Now, this is what I'm going to fuse to my base layer of all my pieces. I like to use woven fuse too. It is a woven interfacing. I recommend that you use it. If you can't get your hands on woven fuse, there is another alternative version. I think it's called SF101. It's similar in how it feels and how it works. So a cotton woven interfacing. And then I have decovil light. We're going to be using this as well, which is another interfacing, but it's more sturdier. And then we have decovil heavy, which is the same as light, but is a more heavier version. So you can kind of see the difference. This is the heavy, and then this is the light. So we're going to be using all three of these interfacings today. Again, if you can't get your hands on Woven Fuse 2, there is SF101. And then depending on if you can't get your hands on decovil, I'm pretty sure there's other options that you can use for like a heavy interfacing and a light interfacing. So if you have those and you're more comfortable working with other ones, you can choose those as well. Next is the thread. I am using this Tech 70 bonded nylon. Now I recommend sticking with bonded nylon or bonded polyester. I'm using Tech 70. You can go up and use Tech 90 if your machine can handle it. But Tech 70 is typically what I like to use, and you can use this on a domestic machine as well. And then the next thing is I'm going to use this magnetic snap. This is a 14mm snap. This is the size that I recommend for it. It's kind of hard for me to take it off of my fingers, but it is a magnetic snap and it's 14mm in size. And I will try to link all of the materials that I'm going to be using for this project down below. So magnetic snap, and then I'll go over the pattern as well. So this is the pattern right here. When you get this, your version might be a little bit different than what mine is looking like right now, because I'm probably going to add a few more things to it. I kind of just printed this out just to get through it. But the first page, you know, has some little instructions and notes on there. And then this is the pattern. So the first thing that you're going to want to go ahead and do is there's two boxes on here. So you want to measure with your ruler. If you use centimeters, you want to use this one. If you measure in inches, you want to use this one. And you just want to make sure that your box measures out to be 1 by 1 inch and 2.5 by 2.5 centimeters. And if it does, that means you printed it correctly. You want to make sure you print this at 100% scale, and you want to print it as a PDF. If you do not do those two things, it will print off-centered and the sizing will be off. So you want to make sure you print it as a PDF at 100% scale, and then you want to test these to make sure it's printed to the right size. So there are several different pages. Each pattern piece is on one page. There's a few pattern pieces on some pages, but you do not have to piece this pattern together. So everything is pretty much printed on its own page. You do not need to piece this together, which makes it simple. So I'm going to show you what you need to do to cut this out. So let's get into that. Okay, so now to cut out your pattern, it's really simple. You want to make sure you're cutting very carefully, and you want to make sure you cut on the outer edge of this black line. So you want to cut on right on the outer edge. Really simple. And when you're cutting out pattern pieces, again, you want to make sure you're cutting nice and slow and precisely, because this really matters. You know, if you cut it wrong, your pattern piece measurement can be off. 1/8 of an inch can make a huge difference in pattern. So I'm just going to cut all of these out. Again, you want to cut on the outer edge, and then I'll check back in once I do this. All right, so now I have all of my pattern pieces cut out, and you should have 5 exterior pieces and then 3 gusset, not gusset, 3 interfacing pieces. So it should be 8 total pattern pieces. And now the next thing that I'm going to do is for the flap and for the card slot on the pattern pieces, there's these little circles that have the snap placement logo on there. And what we're going to do here is we're going to poke holes in the middle of this circle. And what that's going to be is the line, the placement where we're going to place our magnetic snap. So I'm just going to take this little pointed stiletto. You want to make sure you're careful when you do this, because you don't want to poke too hard through the paper because it can rip very easily. So I'm just going to take this and then just poke right in the center. Really simple. And then as you can see, there's not a hole. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the card slot. And this is really easy, nothing too crazy. So now we have a hole on the snap, where the snap's going to be for the card slot, and then where the snap's going to be for the flap. Okay, so now that the pattern is cut out and we have the holes punched for the snap placement, I'm going to go over all of the markings on the pattern. And I just realized right now that I actually put the wrong measurement. This is supposed to say 3/8 of an inch instead of 3/4. So on your pattern, it's going to say 3/8. That is the correct number. On this one, I have to go in and change it. I put the wrong one. So I put the seam allowance on here so you can know what number or seam allowance it's supposed to be sewed with, because there are different ones on this pattern. So like, let's say for instance, on the card slot, the side is going to be sewn with the 3/8 inch seam allowance, but the top and the bottom are going to be sewn with a 1/4 inch. So if you do end up getting confused during construction, you can just look back to the pattern and see where the seam allowance, what seam allowance is supposed to be what. Same thing for the flap, it says 3/4, but it's going to be 3/8, and then the sides are going to be sewn with the 3/8, but this top part is going to be sewn with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So all of the seam allowances on there, and then also I have the grain line on here just so you know where to cut, how to cut this on the fabric as well. So I hope all of that made sense. And now I'm going to move over and show you how to cut this bag out. All right, so I have my fabric laid out, and as you can see, I have the reverse side up, and this is the side that I'm going to be tracing my pattern and cutting from. So the only parts of the denim that I'm going to be cutting out of the pattern piece from this is the wallet body, the wallet gusset, the wallet flap, and the wallet card slot. The lining and everything else is not for the exterior. So what I like to do is I like to trace my pattern out on my fabric. If you don't prefer to do this, if you would rather take pins and pin it to it and cut it out that way, you can. I just like to kind of trace it out. I find that I get a much better line and cut that way. So I'm just going to lay it on top of here, and then I'm going to take my pin and just literally trace the outside of this pattern. It's really simple, nothing too crazy. And then when I do trace straight lines, after I lift my pattern up, I like to go in with a ruler and just straighten my lines to make sure they're 100% straight. I find that that also makes everything a lot smoother. So this is the card slot pattern piece right here. And now what I'm going to do is get my ruler, like I said, and I'm going to straighten up these ends just to make sure this is a nice and straight line. All right, so now I have my pattern piece on here for the card slot, and I only need to cut one of the exterior, and then the other one's going to be cut for the lining. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing for the rest of my pattern pieces. Okay, so I have all of my pattern pieces traced out on the back of my fabric, and I have my cutting mat. So now what I'm going to go ahead and do is take my rotary cutter and cut out all of the pieces that have a flat edge with the rotary cutter. And when you're cutting out your pattern piece, if you traced it, you want to make sure you cut right inside of this line. So when we cut the pattern piece out, we cut on the exterior, but when we're cutting out our fabric, since we're tracing on the outside, let's say this is right here. Since we're tracing on the outside, we want to cut on the inside of this line to get it to be the exact measurement of the pattern. It's kind of weird how it works that way, but it does. So when I'm cutting, I'm going to make sure I'm cutting right on the inside of this line that I marked. And I'm being really in depth because I feel like I always have to over explain myself. And I really just want people to understand like what it is that I'm doing. So as you can see, I hope you can see on camera, this was the line that we drew and I cut right on the inside. So this is what it's looking like now. So I'm just gonna go ahead and cut out all of my pieces, and then I'll check back in and show you what I'm gonna do next. All right, so as you can see, now I have all of my pattern pieces cut out. I went ahead and embroidered my logo off camera. And if you did want to do something like this, now would be the time to do it before you add any interfacing or anything like that. So I went ahead and did that. So I have two exterior gusset pieces. I have one exterior body. I have one exterior card slot. We have one interior card slot, lining, and then two interior gusset pieces. So these are all of the pattern pieces that you need that are all laid out now. So now we're going to move on over to the interfacing part of this project. Okay, so now for cutting out your interfacing, you want to make sure that you grab the pattern pieces that say interfacing on it, and you want to make sure you cut your interfacing with these pattern pieces because they are different sizes than the exterior pieces. So you want to make sure you're cutting it with the interfacing pattern pieces. Now for these ones, it also tells you which interfacing to cut for which body part or which pattern part. So this one, it says body heavy interfacing. So this is the heavy interfacing, and you just want to cut one of this one for the body part, and then the other ones it'll say for the flap, cut two interfacing of the light. So you want to cut two light pieces for the flap, and then for the gusset you want to cut two light pieces of the interfacing for this as well. All of it's on there. So what I'm just going to go ahead and do is pretty much do the same thing that I did for the exterior. I'm just going to trace this pattern piece on here and cut this out. All right, so now I have my interfacing piece cut out of the heavy, so I'm going to go ahead and pretty much do the same thing but with the light, and I'm going to use the pattern pieces for this. So again, the light needs to be cut from for the flap and for the gusset. So I'm going to do two for the flap and then two for the gusset. All right, so now that I have all of my decovil interfacing pieces cut out, the next part of interfacing we need to work on is cutting out the woven fuse. Now for this, what I like to do is I do it a little bit differently. Typically, you would lay your pattern piece on this and then kind of cut it out around the pattern. I like to just take my piece like this and then just cut out a really big square. And you want to make sure, if you do decide to do it this way, that the wrong side of your fabric is facing the side of the interfacing that has the glue or that you would fuse it to. And I fuse it this way. So I would go and fuse it down this way and then just cut off the excess around the fabric. And I like doing it this way because it fuses a lot better versus if I were to just cut out my interfacing with this and then just stick it on there, because sometimes it would slide off, it would move, it wouldn't interface certain parts. So I just do it this way, cut off the excess, really easy. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut this out and then I'll show you what I'm gonna do next. Okay, so I have all of my woven fused 2 pieces cut out, and every single part of the exterior on this bag or wallet is going to be fused with the woven fuse, even the card slot piece. And the reason why you fuse it is because it's going to give the denim a little bit more shape, and it's gonna make it from floppy to give it a little bit more shape. And another reason why is because the areas where we're going to be fusing the decovil, the woven fuse just gives like a really good foundation for fusing that on. The decovil fuses really well to the back of woven fuse. So that's another reason why we're doing that. So I personally use a heat press to fuse all of my interfacing on. If you don't have a heat press, you can just take a piece of parchment paper and iron this to the back of your fabric. I think you want to hold it for 15 seconds. You can use a little bit of steam. You don't want to use too much, but personally, I use a heat press. So I'm going to go downstairs and then use my heat press, and I'll bring you guys along. I won't be doing audio, but I'll show you what I'm doing so you can see, and I'll come back and then talk what's next. All right, so this is me using my heat press, and this is kind of what I meant when I said laying down a piece of parchment paper. Due to me cutting the interfacing so big, I put parchment paper down so that the interfacing doesn't stick to the plate of the heat press, if that makes sense. So with the parchment paper, it doesn't stick. It's easy to just peel off, and that's what I'm doing here. Also, please ignore how dusty my heat press is. I know I gotta clean her. Okay, so I have the woven fuse fused to the back of the pieces, and I don't know if you can tell, but it gives it just a little bit more shape to it, which is exactly what we want. It's beautiful. So now I'm just gonna go ahead and trim this excess interfacing around my fabric. And you wanna make sure when you do this, you're being careful in that or if you do decide to do it this way, you wanna make sure you're being careful in that you're not cutting into your fabric. Because then it'll mess up your pattern piece. And again, you don't have to do it this way. You can do it the regular way and just cut it out as a pattern piece and fuse it to the bag. So I'm just gonna cut all of this and then I'll check back in and show you what is next. All right, so I'm gonna show you guys a visual because I accidentally messed up the measurements for this part, and I really want you guys to understand this step. So for this step, you wanna take your body piece and you wanna turn it to the back side, which is the side that we fused the woven fuse to. And you're gonna wanna draw a line 5/8 inches down from the top and 5/8 inches up from the bottom. And it should look something like this. And then you're gonna draw a 1/2 inch in on the sides, and it's gonna look like this. Now you wanna do this because this is gonna be the guidelines for where our facing is going to sit inside of this pattern piece, so it's outside of our seam allowance. So next you're gonna take your flat piece, and for this one, you're gonna draw a 1/2 inch in all the way around. It's gonna be a 1/2 inch all the way around. You wanna draw that inside at a 1/2 inch. And then you're gonna take your gusset and you're gonna do 5/8 inches down from the top. And then you're gonna do a 1/2 inch around everywhere else. And so you're gonna do this only for the body, the flap, and the gusset. You're not gonna do this for the card slot since we're not fusing decovil to that piece. So I really hope that you guys understood this. I messed up the measurements and I wanted to be more in depth and show you guys what I was talking about for this part. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fuse these with my heat press, but before I do that, when I do my interfacing like this, I like to come over to my iron and I like to just kind of heat the facing up to just tack it down, just so it doesn't move, because it is really small and sometimes when I press the heat plate down, it'll slide. So I'm just gonna tack it down so that it doesn't move while I use the heat press. It's really simple, really quick process. Now, if you're not using a heat press and you're using an iron, this would be the part where you fuse it down. And when you're fusing it, you want to make sure you're at least holding it for, I want to say 15 seconds. And you can use steam as well with this. Steam does work well. I'm using steam just to kind of do this. And again, I'm just doing it to baste it on. It doesn't have to be on all the way. And then I'm going to fuse this and then I'll check back in and let you know what the next steps are. So I went ahead and fused my decovil to the backs of this, and you can see it changed not the texture, but the stiffness of the fabric by a lot. So this is the one where I fused the heavy, this is where I fused the light, and I also fused the light on the back of the flap, and then I fused it on the sides as well. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put these to the side, and I'm going to take my under flap piece and my card slot pattern piece. So the card slot and the underside of the flap. Now, if you are doing what I did and kind of like branding or adding something, embellishing the front of the flap, you're going to put that to the side and you want to make sure you're working on the underside. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to make our dots for where the snaps are going to be on here. So all you have to do is, again, we had poked our hole earlier. So all you have to do is line your pattern piece up on top. I'm going to take my chalk pencil and just dot exactly where that is. It's that simple. And then there is that little dot right there. And we're going to do the same thing for the underside of the flap. Lay it on top. And then dot where we're going to put our snap. So let me grab my snaps and I'm going to show you how to put these in. Okay, so before I do anything else, I'm actually going to show you this part, which is optional. You don't have to do it. Personally, I normally do this for any project where I'm adding a snap. I cut little squares out of decovil heavy. This is the decovil heavy interfacing, the same interfacing that I fused to the body part. I cut squares. Now I cut them, this is a little bigger than 1 by 1, I want to say, but I cut them about 1 by 1 inch. And this is going to go on the back of here, and I'm going to fuse that down. Now what this is going to do is it's going to help stabilize the snap on the back of this so that over time it doesn't wear into the fabric and tear it. So I'm going to fuse that to that, and then I'm going to turn this over and just kind of guess where the dot I put on there is, and as you can see it's right there. So I'm just going to fuse this down, and again, you don't have to do it, it's optional, but I would recommend that you do it. So I'm going to fuse this down and then come and show you how to add the snap on. All right, so I went ahead and fused the little squares to the back of this. And another tip too, when you do this, you want to make sure on the flap, you line the bottom of the square with the bottom of the interfacing, because you don't want to put it too far down and have it fused in your seam allowance. You definitely do not want to do that. And same thing with this part, you want to make sure you keep it out of the top portion where you're going to be sewing it. So you want to just have it down some. So now what I'm going to show you how to do is how to put the snaps on. So when you buy magnetic snaps, they normally come with these little backing pieces. And if you don't feel like using magnetic snaps, you can use whatever snaps you feel comfortable using. I just recommend having it at 14 millimeters. So you want to use a 14 millimeter snap, and magnetic snaps, they come together like this in a set. So I just normally take my pliers and pull it apart like that. So this is considered the, if it would focus, this is considered the female side, and then this is considered the male side. So the male side is going to go on the underside of the flap, and then the female side is going to go on the body of the card slot. So it comes with these little backing pieces like I showed you earlier, and it has 3 cutouts. So there's a center circle and then there's 2 lines on the end. So what we're going to do is the dot that we made, we're going to line the center circle up with that dot until we can see it. So essentially you want to be able to see the center of that line, or not line, that center of that dot we made in the center of this whole cutout. And I'm just going to take my chalk pencil and do a line in these cutouts right here. Really simple. And then now what I'm going to do is I use a seam ripper for this part. And you want to be careful because you don't want to cut too far up past this line. So I'm just going to insert my seam ripper into the into the fabric in the back of the interfacing through the woven fuse and the decovil. And I'm just going to cut up to where the line stops. Now you can use an X-Acto knife. I've just always learned to do this using a seam ripper. So this is how I do it. Okay, and then once you have that, you're going to take your female side and you're going to take the prongs that are on the back. I hope you can see, is it focusing? These prongs on the back, you're going to take it and insert it through the slits that we just put in. You're going to push it in, and then now this is what the back is looking like. And then you're going to take the back support piece, put it over that, and then I like to take pliers and bend the ends down. And you're just going to push it all the way down. And you want to make sure that it's all the way down and flat because you don't want these to not be in right. Okay, so now this is what the back side looks like. It has backing, and then now this is how it looks with the male side of the snap-on. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the same for the card slot. So I'm gonna take the backing piece, I'm going to center it so that I can see the dot that we made through the center cutouts. And I'm going to do lines through those cutouts, take my seam ripper, and then add the slits. And honestly, adding snaps is not as scary as it seems. It seems a lot more scary than what it really is. And again, if you don't want to use magnetic snaps, if you prefer to use actual regular snaps, you can do that too. You just want to follow whatever instructions to the snaps that you're using are and however you should apply them. So now that I have the snap on to here, it's going to close like that. So this is essentially what it is. So we have the back side, and then we have the card slot part. All the preparation is really done, so I can start sewing this together. So I'm going to show you next how what the first thing is that we're going to do. So yeah. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to work on is assembling the flap and attaching that to the body. But before we attach it, we have to actually sew it together. So there's two flap pieces. Again, we have the underside and then we have the top side. So what we're going to do is we're going to sew both of these right sides to right sides. So that means I'm going to take this piece and put it on top of this one, or vice versa, take the other one and put it on top. But you want to make sure that both of these sides are facing each other. And then I'm just going to take these clips and I'm going to clip all the way around. All right, so I have my clips on here and I'm just gonna go ahead and sew around this with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So we're gonna go all the way around this with a 3/8 inch. So let's do that. All right, so again, we're gonna go in and sew this with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And don't worry about this. This is so that I can know where the 3/8 inch is on my machine because I don't have the measurements on my little plate. So I'm just gonna go ahead and line this up to the tape and sew all the way around. And I'm using a 4 millimeter stitch. I think that's what it's called, or my length, my stitch length is set to 4. And I'm just gonna go ahead and sew all the way around this. And I'll check back in once I do that. All right, so I went ahead and sewed the flap together. So now what I'm gonna go ahead and do is I am going to mark a 1/4 inch I'm going to make a 1/4 inch mark away from this curve right here. And the reason why I'm going to do this is because we're going to snip where this curve is right here. And the reason why we're going to add little snips is because it's going to help this curve to sit nicely once we turn everything right side out. So I'm going to do this for both sides. And normally I don't add these, but I'm just going to add them just because, why not? So I have the little lines, so I'm going to add little snips, and I don't want to cut past the indentation lines that I just made. So we're just going to do little tiny slips, and you definitely want to be careful that you don't cut too far. So I did that side, and I'm going to do the same to this side. You don't even have to make them that small. You can do them bigger, actually. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and turn this right side out. Which actually, before I do that, I'm going to cut this seam down some. So I'm going to cut this seam, but I'm not going to cut it there. And then I'm going to leave it at the bottom there, and then I'm going to cut. Again, this is just so it's not so bulky. You don't have to, but I'm just doing that because. So we're going to turn this right side out, and this is probably going to be one of the more trickier parts. Is turning this right side out because it is a small area that we're going to be turning it through. And yes, but you just kind of have to work with it. So what I typically like to do is when I start, just kind of squish it. I take the bottom and just squish it and then just start pushing through. And there may be a point in this where you feel like it's not going to turn all the way out. It will. You just have to keep kind of working it. It's one of the annoying things about sewing when you turn stuff right side out. You have to kind of work with it, especially if it's like stiff denim, which you can see why my hands always hurt. But you're just gonna keep working it and it will eventually turn out. And don't feel like you're gonna rip it or anything. As long as you're using a strong thread and things like that, you should be fine. Okay, so now that I pretty much have this mostly out, I'm gonna take my bone folder. I think this is what it's called. I use this to push my seams out or help me push out my corners. You don't specifically have to use a bone folder. You can use anything that you feel would be good for this, but it just kind of helps to push out your seams, which I might have to push this out a little bit more before. But if you are using something like a bone folder, you want to make sure you don't push too hard because you can rip through the denim. I have done that before. So as you can see, it is now turned right side out. Okay, so now that this is turned right side out, I'm gonna go ahead and press this and iron it to make sure that it lies really nicely. And you always want to make sure that you kind of press in every step. I try to make that a customary thing that I do, is press after every step. It really helps during the process and helps everything look nice and neat. So now that this is pretty much pressed, you can see it looks a lot neater now, so much cleaner. So I'm going to go ahead and go back over to my machine and I'm going to top stitch on the edge of this with a 1/8 inch seam allowance. So not seam allowance, I'm going to stitch 1/8 inch away from the edge around the whole perimeter of this flap. All right, so I'm back at my machine and I switched my stitch length from a 4 all the way to a 5, and that's the highest that my machine will go to. I just love top stitching with a 5 stitch length. And yes, for those who are wondering, I am sewing with a zipper foot. I just prefer to sew with a zipper foot. I like working with that kind of foot. So I'm just going to sew along here 1/8 inch away from the edge of this, and I'm going to go all the way around. I'm even going to sew the top of this close. So, and when you're top stitching, you definitely want to sew slow because you want to make sure your stitches are nice. And I typically like to check the back and make sure my tension looks good, and it does. And when I get to the curve, I'm just going to lift up my foot and just keep going. I like to walk around my curves just to have control and make sure everything looks nice. So I'm just going to keep sewing and then I'll check back in once I finish this. All right, so I went ahead and top stitched the flap and it looks amazing. It also looks good on the underside. So now that I have this done, I'm gonna go ahead and take the body piece. So this is the body of the wallet. And what I'm gonna do is I'm going to attach the flap to this. So what we need to do is fold this in half. Don't be scared. I know it sometimes seems scary to fold in half. We're gonna fold it in half and we're going to take a chalk or a marking utensil and just do a little dash. And this is so that we can find the center point. So we're gonna do that right there. And then we're also going to do the same. If you turn the flap around and fold it, we're going to make a mark on the center of the back side of the flap. And so this is so that we can line this center mark up with this center mark. So before we do that, we're actually going to draw a line down 1 7/8 inches down from the top of the back. So we're going to take this, and I normally like to line up the dash with, let's say, a line right here so I know that I'm exactly centered. So I'm gonna go 1 7/8, and then I'm just going to draw a line. Now you don't have to draw all the way to the edge considering the flap doesn't go all the way to the edge. And then I'm just going to mark out my center point on here as well. Now, what I'm going to do is I am going to take the flap piece, and on the underside of the flap, I'm going to draw a line 1/4 inch down from the top. And this is the line that we're going to use to sew on top of. And the reason why I draw a line is because when I do this, I won't be able to see the indents on my plate or the seam allowance indents on my plate to know where it is. So I like to draw the line across. I said earlier in the materials, double-sided tape, it's kind of optional. I like to use it because it really makes this process easier and you know everything is lining up. So this is 1/8 inch double-sided tape, and I'm going to take this and I'm going to grab the flap, and on the right side of the flap at the top, all the way at the top, I want to make sure it's at the top because I don't want this to be showing after I sew everything together, I'm just going to stick it on. And this is what's going to hold this flap in place while we sew. Peel this off. And now, this indentation that I put on here that marks the center, and then the center line of that, I'm just gonna line the top of the flap up with this line that we drew, and I'm gonna line these center marks together. I feel like I'm not explaining this good, but yeah, you can see what I'm doing. So then I'm just gonna stick that down. And then I use this, I call it like a seam hammer, and I just take it and kind of flatten it so that I know that it's on there. So now I'm going to go to my machine and sew on this line. I'm going to go over it again to make it so that I can see better. And then sew directly on this line, which is going to resemble a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm back at my machine and I switch my stitch length back to a 4 because I don't want to sew with a 5. That would be too loose, I feel. So I'm just going to sew directly on that line that we marked out. Backstitch. I like to backstitch 2 times and then backstitch. And I can tell when I have the back kind of lined up if this is straight across and the stitching looks good, which it is. So I'm going to show you what to do next. All right, so I'm back at my iron. Like I said, I normally like to press and iron every step of the way. So now that we have this sewn on, we're going to take the flap and flip it down. Now this is why I designed this to not have the interfacing and make sure it's well out of the way, because if it was, this would be way too thick and hard to kind of flip down. So I'm going to press this down, and when you're doing this, you want to make sure that you're pressing it well and that it's flipped all the way down. So when I'm pressing, I kind of like to take it and hit against that seam to make sure it's all the way up and laying flat. And that should be pretty good right there. All right, so now I'm going to take my little thing that I like to call a seam hammer, and I'm just going to hammer these corners right here because this is where it's really thick and it's hard to kind of sew through that sometimes. So I like to hammer it to lay it flat. All right, so as you can see from hammering it, sometimes I think because it flattens the fibers of the denim, if I'm not mistaken, it gives kind of like an indentation, but you can't really see it once I top stitch. So I'm going to go to my machine and I'm going to top stitch 1/8 inch away from the edge, and then I'm going to do another top stitch 1/8 inch away from the first top stitch that I just put down. So let's do that. All right, so again, I switched my stitch length back to a 5, and I'm just going to go ahead and sew 1/8 inch away from the edge. Again, once I come back to this edge, I'm going to go slow because it's the thickest area and just backstitch. Now I'm going to go in and do the same thing, but right above the stitch that I just put down. And I'm going to put this a little bit tighter. So right above this stitch, I'm going to do the same thing. Okay. All right, so now we have the flap sewn on and attached to the actual back body of the wallet. So now that I have that done, I'm going to put this to the side, and I'm going to grab my exterior card slot pattern piece and my interior card slot pattern piece. And I'm going to put these right sides to right sides, and I'm going to sew these together. So I'm going to sew it together here with the 1/4 inch, and I'm going to sew it there with the 1/4 inch as well. All right, so my stitch length is at 4, and I'm just going to start sewing straight across. All right, so I have the lining attached to the card slot, and what I'm going to do is we left the sides open, so what we're going to do is turn it right side out through the sides. Really easy. This is not a difficult part at all. And now what we're going to do is we're going to push this seam up and out, and we want to make sure we're pushing this seam all the way out because we want it to be even. And I just like to take a clip. I like to add a clip just to hold the seam out. And I'm gonna go ahead and do the same for the other side. All right, so now that I went ahead and put my clips on, I'm just going to press at the seam. So I'm just going to remove the clips and then but press that seam down. And it should lay really nice and flat after pressing it. Again, pressing, I like to make it a crucial step almost after everything I do because it makes a huge difference. And then sometimes I like to go in and just add a clip back on both ends. And I'm going to do the same for this side. All right, so now I'm going to top stitch on the edge of this 1/8 inch away from the edge. And I am going to be using the zipper foot. I already have been because it is a really small space between the snap and the edge. And I do recommend using the thinnest foot you can to get close. Hopefully you have one. And I had to put a band-aid on because apparently I cut my hand and didn't realize it. So I'm just going to top stitch 1/8 inch away from the edge. And of course, I'm using a 5 length stitch. And this time when I sew, I'm actually going to sew all the way around and close up the edge. So I'm going to sew all the way around because I no longer need these ends open. All right, so now we have our card slot done, and this is what it's looking like. So this is the front of it, and then this is the back where the lining is. So now that this is done, we're gonna go ahead and take our body piece of the wallet, and we're just gonna lay the card slot on here essentially like this. But first, before we do that, I'm going to measure from the front 1 inch down. So I'm gonna measure 1 inch down, and I'm just gonna make a little notch on this end. And I'm just going to make a little notch on that end. And this is going to be a guideline to line up where this is. Now, when we line this up, we want to make sure we have our snap closer to this, far away from the flap essentially. So the snap goes to the front and this is where the back is. If you put it this way, it's not going to work. So you want to make sure you have the snap going this way. And I'm just going to clip it, lining it up to where we just made these 1 inch lines. So now that the clips are on, I'm going to go ahead and baste 1/8 inch away from this edge and 1/8 inch away from this edge as well. All right, so now we have the card slot basted onto the body piece. And as you can see, it's just one open slot right now. It's one open slot. So now what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to fold this in half. Again, do not be afraid to fold it in half. It is fine. Everything is okay. And we're going to fold it and then we're going to add a little notch. Is it called a notch or just a little? We're going to mark the center point. So I'm going to fold it and find the center point of that. And after we have the center point, we're just going to connect this line straight across. All right, so that is the center point right there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark 1 inch on both ends of the center line. So I'm going to mark and draw a line right there. That's 1 inch. And then I'm going to come over here and do another line. That is 1 inch. And then we're just going to stitch directly on top of this line and on top of this line. We're not going to sew on top of this one. This one is going to stay empty. I'm going to end up erasing that. All right, now typically when I do this, I would go in and change my thread color to kind of match whatever color my exterior is. But I honestly think that the look of the goldish color stitching would look really nice on here. So again, we're going to stitch directly on top of this line. So you want to make sure you're sewing really nice and slow because you want your stitching to look decent, especially if it's a contrasting color. And essentially what these stitches are going to do is it's going to close off this card slot and make it to where it's not open all the way. So essentially we're just dividing it up into 2 sections to create 2 separate card slots. And as you can see, that looks amazing. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same on this one. All right, so now that we have our card slot stitched closed, I'm going to show you kind of what it's looking like. I have this really old iTunes gift card. Do not ask me why I still have this. But as you can see, it fits really nicely. And I kind of made the card slots a little shorter than the cards because I like when I'm able to see the top of my cards when I'm looking in so that I can be like, okay, this is, you know, because you can tell by the color of a card which one it is, like debit card, credit card, things like that. So really nice. I love it. So I'm going to now show you how to sew the side gusset on. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to find the center point of this, which we already did when we did a line. I can still kind of see where I put my markings at. So I'm just going to go over this to make it more seeable. So we have the center point on the body of the wallet. So now we're going to fold this in half and find the center point on the bottom of each gusset piece. And this is just so that we can line these up perfectly. Center point right there. All right, so now we're going to take this gusset piece and we're going to sew this right sides to right sides. Now it may be a little scary. It's really not that bad. I'm being honest, it's not as scary as it looks. So we're going to take the center point from the gusset and line it up on the center point of the body piece, and then just add a clip. And this is the part where I say I like to use staples, and this is where it's going to come in handy. If you're using a woven material, staples are going to be a lifesaver in bag making, because when you're sewing on a gusset, the little clips, they like to pop off. But when you use a staple, it can't go anywhere. It's going to stay there while it's doing that, while you're sewing. So it's really amazing. I love using staples, but if you're using something like vinyl, you will not be able to do this because it will leave holes in it unless you use the staples well inside of your seam allowance, so it's not going to show through the exterior. So the flap on the pattern, I designed it to taper in so you can kind of move it out of your way while you're working. It may be a little bit difficult to kind of maneuver around it, but it shouldn't be anything too bad. So now I'm going to take this end and line it up to the end of the body of the wallet, and then I'm just going to add a staple right there. And I like to staple really close to the edge to make sure I'm not going to be stapling inside of my seam allowance. And then before I do the other side, I'm just going to fit this in. So now what we're going to do, since we're sewing a curve, we're going to add little slits like how we did when we did the flap. So I'm going to add little slits. I should probably get my fabric scissors. I'm going to add little slits where the gusset is going to be curving around the body piece, and this is just going to make it easier to fit in or fit it onto that curve. I hope this is making sense. And you again do not want to cut too far, about a 1/4 inch in, maybe not even that far in, honestly. And then it should start to curve nicely and fit a lot better in there. I don't know if you can see that. I hope you can. And then I'm just going to, first I'm going to add clips and then go in and staple. And just make sure you're taking your time with this part. Don't rush it because it should fit perfectly. The pattern and the measurements are 100% perfect and correct. So it's definitely going to fit. You just have to kind of take your time. Don't rush. Especially if this is your first time kind of doing something like this. Just be patient. It's not as scary as it seems. So then I'm going to line this end of the gusset with this end of the body of the wallet. Add a staple as close to the edge as I can, which that piece looks a little uneven. So when I need to take a staple out, if something's wrong, I just literally grab pliers and pull it. It's a lot easier than a staple remover. Perfect. So I'm going to staple these ends to make sure these do not pop off while I'm working on the other side. It is a little awkward, the shape of it. I'm not even going to lie to you, but it's not that bad. Okay, so I have that side stapled on, and I'm gonna do the same thing and add slits right here in this curved area. And I hope I'm not being boring and this is really making sense and helpful to how to put this pattern together. I'm trying to make a more in-depth style just because I like really in-depth stuff when I'm like doing tutorials or like just looking up how to do something. So that's why I'm making it this style. And I'm just gonna put some clips in there. And again, it fits perfectly. Oh, I love when my pattern pieces line up. It's good. It did do something to my soul. It do something to my soul. So I'm just going to finish this and then check back in when it's time for me to start sewing. All right, so now I'm going to start sewing this, and I'm going to sew this with a black thread because it is the thread that I think matches closest to this that I have, and I like to use a color that matches because I don't want the color seeping through on the seam. So I'm just gonna go ahead and sew this with the 3/8 inch seam allowance, and it looks like it's gonna be a lot more difficult than it is. It actually isn't that bad. At least sewing the first side is pretty easy. It's when it comes time to sew the other side where it gets a little harder. But yeah, so I'm just gonna sew this with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and make sure you take your time. It's gonna line up perfectly. Everything is good. You just need to take your time. And if you use staples like me, you don't have to worry about anything really popping off or coming apart. You just need to make sure you're taking your time and working around this curve nicely. And this is why I say having a pointed stiletto is really amazing, because you can kind of use it as another finger and it just really helps a lot. So I have this now sewn together. As you can see, it was not that bad. And I'm gonna go around it another time. I like to do 2 stitches when I'm sewing the gusset just to make sure it's secure. Even though I'm using a really strong thread, I still like to do around 2 times. So I'm just gonna stitch directly on top of this, and then I'll show you what I'm gonna do for the next side. All right, so I went ahead and double stitched this side. So now what I'm gonna do is take these staples out. I know you guys are probably like, do you leave the staples in? No, you wanna make sure you take them out 100%. You do not wanna leave the staples in. So I just go around and take each staple out. It's really not that hard or bad. And then I'm gonna show you what to do for the next side. All right, so this is what it's essentially looking like from the exterior. And we're gonna pretty much do the same thing that we did for the other side, but for this side. So we're going to take our gusset piece that has our center marking right there, and we're going to line it up to the body piece that has the center mark right there. This side is normally a little bit more trickier to sew because we don't have as big as an open space anymore, since we have this side sewn on and then we're going to be sewing this one. So definitely just make sure you take your time. It shouldn't be too bad. The only thing that would make this more difficult is the fact that it's a small item. So I'm just going to go ahead and fit this piece in and then start sewing it. So now I'm about to start sewing the second side, and I'm gonna again do the same thing, just sew it with the 3/8 inch seam allowance. And again, this side is a little bit more difficult to sew, but again, if you just take your time and go through it, it shouldn't be too bad. Now, what I recommend doing is kind of when you're sewing, especially when you get up close to the flap, you want to push the flap kind of over so that you're able to have more room to lay this flat. It makes it a lot easier versus just having it in the way and trying to sew. If you just push it over, it makes it so much more easier. All right, so I have it sewn all the way around. I went ahead and took the staples out of this side. So now what I'm gonna do, the next step, is something that's going to make our life a lot easier when it comes time to attach the lining to the exterior. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to open up these side seams and I'm going to baste it at the top with a 1/8 inch away from the edge. And it's just going to make this seam lie flat so that when we go to sew our lining to the exterior, this is laid flat and it's going to make it so much easier. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that to all of these seams. I'm just gonna go ahead and baste them flat, open, and down. All right, so I tried to make this as easy as possible to see. I hope that you can see. So it is a little hard, I'm not gonna lie, to kind of get your foot, to get this kind of under your foot because you have to kind of squish the project to do that. Don't be scared to squish your stuff. That is really part of bag making. Squishing and squashing is just part of the process. Do not be afraid of it. So I'm going to baste it from the outside. So these seams are flat right now. You wanna make sure they're flat. And then you're just going to go in and baste right at the top at a 1/8. Literally that simple. It is laying flat. I could have did a better job at keeping that one at the top, but it's fine. It really doesn't make that big of a difference. So now I'm gonna go around and do that to all of the other ones as well. All right, so now that I have these kind of basted open, I'm just gonna go ahead and trim down the seam allowance a little bit because I did sew it with the 3/8 of an inch and I don't want it to be so bulky when I turn it right side out. So I'm not going to trim at the top where I'm basting it. I'm gonna kind of start under and I'm not going to trim that much, just a little bit, probably like 1/8 of an inch off. And this is just going to help this not be so bulky when I go to turn it right side out, especially in this curved area. So make sure you're not cutting too close to your stitching. You want to keep it a good distance away from that. Again, keep it around like about 1/8 of an inch. Bam, looks good. And I'm going to do the same for this side. So again, we're going to start under where we laid our seam flat. And if you can kind of see where it's like a little wavy, if you need to, you can kind of hold it down, hold the fabric down with your finger, but watch your finger so you don't cut it. And then just trim it off. All right, so now we have that trimmed and the exterior is pretty much sewn together. So now I'm going to show you what to do with the lining. Okay, so now I have the lining pieces and it's really simple, not too many pieces for the lining. So we have the pattern pieces for the gusset and then for the body piece. And the reason why the body piece is in 2 pieces instead of one big one is because we're going to use this, we're going to leave a bottom of the hole in the lining and that's what we're going to use to turn the whole project right side out through. So essentially I designed this pattern to be left a hole in the bottom so that we can turn it right side out. So what we're going to do is we're going to sew this right sides to right sides at the bottom. We're going to clip it and we're going to sew it with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. But we're not going to sew all the way across the bottom. We're only going to sew like a little corner right there and then a little corner right there, and then the rest we're going to leave open so that we can use that to turn everything right side out through. And we're going to try to sew as little as possible because the bigger you leave the hole, the easier it is to turn everything out. So I'm going to go ahead and sew this and show you how that process is. All right, so now I'm going to sew this with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and again we're not going to be sewing all the way across the bottom, so I am just going to back stitch and 4 4 4. I'm gonna probably go back even one more stitch, like about that far, because again you want to leave as big of an opening as possible. It makes things so much easier, and you want to make sure that you back stitch a good amount because it's going to be a good amount of tension on these stitches when we're going to pull everything right side out, and you don't want anything to rip. So now when we go to sew this side, we're going to start about how far away we want the stitches to stop. Go forward and go back, right? Just back stitching to make sure that this is going to be good enough. And as you can see, there is a hole right there that we're going to use to turn everything right side out. All right, so I actually just went in and did a little change. So I recommend that you do this too. I went ahead and marked a 1/2 inch on the bottom from the edge of each end. And I recommend stitching to the 1/2 inch line on both ends. And I'm going to show you why in a second. So with the gusset, what we're gonna do is pretty much the same thing that we did for the exterior. We're gonna go ahead and find the center point of this gusset right here, mark it right there, and we're gonna do the same for this one. Like so. I'm actually gonna baste this down right now just to have it lay flat and open so it's easier to work with. So I'm gonna baste this down on this side and I'm gonna baste it flat on this side, just like how I did for the exterior of the side seams. All right, so I went ahead and basted the seam flat so it's gonna lay flatter, which is gonna make this process a lot easier. Now I'm using waterproof canvas for my lining. If you're using something else, you know, you can do the same thing. Waterproof canvas is a little bit stubborn. It has no stretch to it whatsoever. So it is a little bit of an annoyance to sew sometimes, especially with curves. So we're gonna do the same thing that we did for the exterior. We're gonna line the center point up to the gusset to this center seam, if it's gonna focus, to the center seam right there. That's the center. So we're gonna line those two up and add a clip. And I don't really have to worry too much about the clips popping off on this because they stay pretty well because it's not really a stiff textile. So now I'm gonna do the same thing that we did for the exterior and add a little bit of snips right here. They go around the curve nicely. And again, like I was saying, waterproof canvas is a very stubborn textile and it has no stretch to it. So when you go to sew curves with this, it is going to pucker. There's no way around it. I have learned that it's just gonna have puckers, so I just sew the puckers in, but they're honestly not even that noticeable. It's really not that bad. So if you're gonna be using waterproof canvas too, don't worry too much. Try to get as many out as you can, but they're gonna be there. And when you go to turn everything right side out, it's really not even noticeable. All right, so now this is clipped all the way around. So we're gonna sew the first side on. I actually need to flip all these clips the other way. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna sew this with, we're gonna start out with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And the reason why we're gonna start out with a 3/8 inch seam allowance is because that's the seam allowance. But after we get to like about a 1/2 inch down, we're going to increase it to a 1/2 inch. And the reason why we're going to increase it to a 1/2 inch is because when you're sewing your linings, you want to increase your seam allowance or else it's going to be really saggy inside of the bag. So you want your lining to be a little bit smaller than the exterior so it sits nicely inside of it. So we're going to start out with a 3/8, increase to a 1/2 inch. And then when we get to like about a 1/2 inch up, we're gonna go back down to a 3/8 inch. So I'm gonna kind of show you when I'm sewing it. So let's start doing that. All right, so again, we're gonna start out with the 3/8 inch seam allowance, which is the seam allowance of this pattern. So we're gonna do that, back stitch. And then once we get about right here, we're gonna increase to a 1/2 inch. And that's also why I said that you want to sew to about a 1/2 inch there and then stop your stitching, because you need a 1/2 inch to go all the way around, if that makes sense. So again, waterproof canvas is really stubborn with the puckering. I try to get them out as best as I can, but this is like the most stubborn textile ever. So if you're using this too, again, just take your time and kind of try to work them out as best as possible. Now, if you're using a different textile, this part of it may be a little bit easier. Like if you're using a cotton or something, and if you are using cotton, I would definitely recommend that you interface it or fuse it when interfacing, just to give it a little bit more shape and a better feel to it. You could use the woven fuse, SF101, those are really good. So again, we're still sewing at a 1/2 inch, and then once we get around to back to the top, we're gonna decrease it back to a 3/8 of an inch. So about right here, we're gonna start decreasing it back to a 3/8. Honestly, it has really small puckering, but it's not that bad. Waterproof canvas is very stubborn with corners. Like it really is. That's one of my least favorite things about working with it. So now I'm gonna go ahead and sew the other side on, and then I'll show you what we're gonna do next. All right, so I went ahead and sewed the other side on, and I also basted the side seams down just like how we did the exterior. And I'm going to do the same thing again, how we did the exterior, and trim this down. But I'm not going to trim all the way from up here. I'm going to start a little lower from the basting of the side seam, and then I'm just going to trim this a little bit. And the reason why, again, is because we don't want our seams to be extremely bulky. We're just going to trim it down. And I really recommend basting your side seams before you trim this. It just makes it a lot easier. So now that we have the lining all done and complete, again, it has a hole in the bottom. We're going to take the exterior and we're going to push the flap down inside of it. We're going to now kind of push it like this. Just push it inside. And you want to make sure it's pushed all the way down. And then we're going to take our lining and then we're going to turn it right side out. Now, we are going to put the lining right side to the right side of the exterior. So we're going to sew this pretty much right side to right side. So now we're going to put the lining inside of the wallet. Now this may seem like it's going to be really confusing. It's really not that difficult. And then we're going to line the side seams up. So you see this side seam right there, we're going to line it up to that side seam right there. And this side seam right there, we're going to line up to that side seam right there. So we're going to, and just take your time. Again, you don't have to rush. It is a smaller piece, so this part may be a little tricky due to it being small, but just take your time. Again, we're going to line side seams up. It's best to line up the side seams first and then the rest of it. I like to do the same thing that I do for when I have to sew the gussets to the exterior. I like to use staples for this part just because I find that the clips like to pop off as well for this and it causes the lining to slide. So I like to take a staple and just put one right there all the way around, especially for the side seams, so that I know these do not move and that they stay together. So now that we have the lining basted to this, I'm going to go ahead and sew at a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way around here. So let's do that. Okay, so I'm going to sew it this way, like this. You want to sew your lining like this with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And it may seem really difficult. It's really not too bad. Just take your time when sewing it. You don't want to move too fast. All right, so we're going to do this and then back stitch. And this really, it's not that bad. It looks a lot scarier than it really is. A lot of bag making is looking scarier than it is. Now you may have to take your time and maneuver. Again, it is a really small item, so you want to make sure your seams are flat as well. And before you do any moving of your piece, make sure your needle is down. I learned that the hard way so many times. Honestly, the hardest part of sewing this part is sewing the side gussets because it's a really small width at 2 inches. It's like not a lot of room to really work with. But again, really just take your time, don't stress. It's a lot easier said than done because I'd be stressing sometimes. All right, so then we're just gonna meet right back where we started and then backstitch. All right, so the lining is now sewn to the exterior. So what we're gonna go in and do is, if you're like me and you use staples to hold it together, you're just gonna pull the staples out. You wanna make sure you pull all of your staples out if you ever decide to use them. So once I pull these out, we're just gonna go ahead and pull the whole entire project right side out through that hole, which is funny enough called birthing. The process of that is called birthing, turning a project through a really small hole. When I learned that, I was like, wow, that's really funny. What I'm going to do is pull the lining out. Just pull it all the way out. And this is the size of the hole we have to work with. As you can see, it is not much at all. But birthing is really just the process of taking your time and not rushing through it. So the first thing that I normally like to do when I'm birthing a bag that has a flap is I like to dig to the bottom and pull the flap out like this. It's the first thing I like to do because it just gets the flap out of the way. And then we're just going to ease this out. It's a really small piece, so it's not like you have too much to really birth, but it's a small hole, so it is at the same time a little difficult. But just take your time. Do not have to rush. And please be careful of your fingers. I almost broke my thumb one time birthing a bag. In this process, it hurt really bad, so just please be careful of your thumbs. So I'm trying to get most of the corners through. It looks like there's sometimes in the process of birthing where you're like, this just isn't gonna work, it's not gonna go through, but eventually it does. You just gotta keep working it. And again, do not be scared to squish and push and maneuver the project. As long as you're using a really good thread and you use a good interfacing, you should be fine. So it's finally starting to kind of go through, and then we can just start pushing. And when you're doing this, again, please be careful of your thumbs. This is also a reminder to myself to be careful. So now that this is mostly out, I'm gonna go in and just push out those corners. Beautiful. Same thing here. I'm gonna go in, push out the corner. Like so. And I'm just gonna push the lining in. Like this. And now I'm gonna show you what we're gonna do next. All right, so now that we have this attached, it looks kind of a mess right now. Do not judge your project just yet. So what we're gonna do is I'm going to kind of pull the lining out, and I'm gonna stick my fingers in and push this seam out. Also, do not worry about the markings on my lining. Sometimes a little bit of the dye, if I'm using like a really light color with a really dark denim, the dye, if it's rubbing up against it really hard, will kind of rub off. Sometimes I have to go in and clean the lining, which is annoying, but I just want to make sure that I'm pushing my finger against the seam. I don't know if you can see, and I'm just going to fold it back. And essentially what we're doing is pushing the seam all the way out. And again, I'm using the hole in the bottom of the lining to kind of take my finger and push it up against this seam. Okay, so now that I have it pretty much clipped, I'm gonna go around again. And really what I wanna do is try to push as much of the lining back as possible so that it doesn't overlap over the denim. I don't know how to explain it, but you want to make sure that your lining is not much higher than your denim to where you can see it from the exterior, if that makes sense. When you're working, you'll probably notice what I'm talking about, so you kind of just want to take the lining and fold it back so that it's not higher than the denim. So I like to take my pliers. I use pliers a lot. I should have added this to the materials list, honestly, but I'm gonna take pliers. I'm pretty sure there's another tool that you can use that's more appropriate for this, but I take pliers, and on the seams, on the areas where both of the seams meet for the exterior and interior, that's where it's really thick. I take pliers and I just smash it, like literally just mash it. And what that's going to do is just flatten it. It's kind of like hammering it, but you're just applying pressure. Now, I will say, depending on what material you're using, you don't want to do that because pliers do have little ridges on the inside and it can damage your fabric depending on what you're using. So if you're not using like a woven material, again, I probably wouldn't recommend doing that. Or if you want, you can hammer these. I personally just find that this is what works good for me. I sometimes hammer it too, depending on how stiff it is. Now that I've done that, there's one last final step before we start top stitching. This is optional, you don't have to do this, but again, it's going to make your life a lot better. Staples. So, I have noticed when I go to top stitch, clips like to pop off. It's not the most convenient thing to use, it's really annoying. And the lining sometimes likes to move and raise up higher than the denim. But not too long ago, I found that using staples, once again, holds everything in place. It keeps the lining down so it doesn't slide up, and you don't have to worry about your clips popping off, and it holds everything perfectly in place. So I'm just going to go in and add staples all the way around, and it's just going to ensure that everything is held down and it will not be moving while I'm sewing or top stitching this. And you want to make sure when you're doing this part, you're stapling a little bit of a ways down. We're going to be top stitching within 1/8 inch away from the edge, so just make sure you give yourself enough room. So then I'm just going to go around with the pliers and make sure all of the staples are flat and not sticking up, because if they're sticking up, you will be poking your fingers and stabbing them, and it's not fun. Ask me how I know. I can take these clips off, and now we can go over to the machine and top stitch this edge with a 1/2 inch away from the top of this. Okay, now this is probably going to be the most or more difficult step of this project is top stitching this. And the reason why it's more difficult is because getting it under the foot is a bit of a challenge. If you have a cylinder arm, this would be a breeze. I can't wait till I can get one because it would make top stitching so much easier. But yeah, it's kind of difficult. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna kind of push it like this, and I like to start by the side seam. That's normally where I start, the side seam by the back of the flap. I'm gonna push this down like that. And don't be afraid to squish and squash, again, like I said, because that is part of bag making. It's gonna happen. You cannot run from it. So don't be afraid to do that. Just get it under there. And we're gonna top stitch a 1/8 inch away from the edge. And I'm using a number 5 stitch length as well. And you just want to take your time and go nice and slow. So, and then as you go, you're going to have to keep squishing it to get certain parts under there. So just take your time. Even with the staples, as you can see, the lining still a little bit kind of goes over the denim, but it's not nearly as bad as it would be without the staples. Honestly, this is not that bad. And this, again, is another perfect example of why I made or designed this pattern for the interfacing to be a lot smaller than this, because in this process, if that interfacing wasn't outside of our seams, we would be sewing through that right now, and it would make this much more difficult than it already is. Now, when you get to the sides, it is going to be a bit of a challenge. Again, just take your time. Don't be afraid to kind of squish and squash. I hate that term, squish and squash. Just take your time, especially when you're going over the seams too, because those are the thickest areas. Sometimes I walk my machine over the seams. Did I say walk my seams over the seams? I walk my stitches over the seams. Or foot. I don't. It's been a long day. So again, the name of the game for this is just pushing, pulling, squishing, and making sure it's under the foot and you're stitching 1/8 inch away from the edge. You can imagine the stiffer the project, the harder this is and the more your hands hurt. This one isn't too bad, honestly. I designed the interfacing method on this to not be too bad. Okay, let's go down and then, all right. It is top stitch. Now the scary part is when you look through to make sure everything looks decent, and it does. Yay. Okay, so now what I'm gonna go ahead and do is I'm going to take my little tool called the Thread Zap. It's a thread burner, and this is amazing for burning and sealing off threads. Instead of using a lighter, it works amazing. So I'm going to go ahead and do this and clean up any little threads that I honestly do not want. All right, so this is now top stitched. I do not like how this back stitching right there is. So when you do it, make sure you don't back stitch too much. I personally don't like the look of back stitches. I try to avoid them as much as possible, at least with top stitching, because it just bothers me. I don't like it, but couldn't avoid it for this one. So I'm gonna pull these stitches, or not stitches, these staples out. And then we're gonna go ahead and close the lining, and then I'm gonna show you the last and final step for your new beautiful wallet. Okay, so to close your lining, it's really simple. All you need to do is pull it out, and we're going to fold in these edges right there. Going to add a little clip. We're just going to fold it in. And with the way that this lining is finished off, it does have a little seam at the bottom of the lining. It's not that big of a deal to me. Normally I avoid doing my linings this way, but with this design, I couldn't avoid it because I don't like doing drop-in linings. I've never done one. Actually, I have. I think I've done one, but I typically stick to doing my linings by sewing them and then turning it right side out. So this is how I designed it to be. So you're just gonna hem pretty much both raw ends and then just clip them together like so. This is a really easy closing off of your lining, like super duper easy. Like that. And as you can see, it is close. And then we're just going to give a 1/8 inch stitch along the edge of this, and your lining will be closed. So let's go in and do that. All right, so now we're going to top stitch this close, and we're going to use a 1/8 inch stitch away from the edge, or stitch 1/8 inch away from the edge, and I'm using a number 5 stitch length as always. And you want to make sure that both of the hems are lined up, because if not, you may not catch the underside. So you want to make sure they're both lined up, and then just stitch it closed. And you want to go from one edge all the way to the other. Just one straight line. And then once you do that, you just, if you have one, I would recommend burning these loose little threads right here just so that you can't see them, and it makes it look a little cleaner on the inside. All right, so once you have this stitch, you just want to push it down in the bottom. Literally push it down, and you can see there is a little bit of a seam in there. Excuse the freaking dye on the lining. I really have to clean this, but as you can see, there's a little seam at the bottom, but honestly, it's fine. It's not that big of a deal. It's once you have stuff in here, you honestly won't even notice it. So now I'm going to show you the last and final step, which is pressing this to get it nice and pristine. All right, so now for the last and final step, which is pressing your piece. You want to make sure you press your piece when you're done. I always tell myself I will never judge if I like a piece or not until after I pressed it, because that makes all of the difference in the world, trust me. So I have this little tailor's hem. I made this like years ago. I use this, so normally I just stick it in the bag like this, and then I just kind of iron the front. Really easy. And this is also really good because sometimes, you know, when you're turning the bag right side out or through all the squishing that you've done in the bag making, sometimes the lifting, I mean, not lifting, the facing or interfacing you use may lift a little. And with decovil, once it's heated back up, it softens and the glue kind of, you know, gets warm again and it kind of sticks back down, which is really good. So what I like to do is I like to push the seam out like this. So I push it out and kind of fold it. So I fold it in half, and I do this for all seams on the piece. I'll fold it in half like this and then just press it down. And this just helps that seam to lie nicely and give it a really nice crisp line. Like, do you see how good that looks? So dope. And then I'm gonna do the same for the bottom. So just push it out and fold it. Again, do not be scared to squish this, even though you are pressing it and getting it in the final stage. It's just part of the process. As you can see, it looks a lot cleaner, and I'm gonna do the same for this right here. Pressing is one of my favorite parts because it's just so cool to like see it actually take its final form, especially with a project that you've been working on for days. Press this. And as you can see, we have a really nice side gusset, and then I'll sometimes go in like this and then just give this side a nice press like so. And then as you can see the difference from this side versus this side, like a complete and total difference. So this is why I say pressing is really crucial. So now I'm gonna do the same to this side right here. Fold it and press. And pressing it also with the decovil, since when you're heating it up, it softens up, it makes it easier to shape. Much easier to shape. Kind of like clay almost. And same thing for the bottom. Perfect. Now I'm going to kind of press the bottom as well. You want to press as much as you can. Just trust me, it makes a difference. This already looks so much freaking better. Now, what I like to do too, once again, pliers. I love these things. This area right here is really thick. So I like to take pliers and just flatten it. It also helps this side seam to lay much better. But again, depending on what material you're using, you probably don't want to do this. But it just helps that to lay better. Real nice. And then sometimes what I like to do, which for this I normally do, I like to kind of fold this and pinch it in like this and then give it a press, because I don't like, with this design, the gusset to poke out when the flap is closed. I kind of like it to close and it kind of have like a folded look versus it sticking out like that. I like it to kind of fold in so you can't see it. So as you can see the difference, this side was pressed, this side was not. If you like this look, you can leave it. You don't have to do that. Personally, I like it to have a little bit more of a folded in look. So again, I just fold it from this seam to this seam and then just give it a press. And if you really want it to hold its shape, which is what I do, while it's warm, the facing is warm, you want to take a little clip. I'm going to use a bigger one. And this is going to hold it, kind of help it to, normally this goes on easier. I don't know why. It doesn't want to go on there, so I'm going to clip it there. But it just helps it to hold its shape like that. That's if you like a folded edged look. Now, you can leave it on however long you want. You don't really have to leave it on that long, but I'm just gonna go for the press look and then give the flap one little last press, like bam. And the wallet is complete. It is beautiful. You can close it up. You can also do more shaping if you want, if you don't like If you want it to be more folded in, or if you want it to not be folded in, you can kind of shape it up as much as you want. And this is essentially what we have. So this is the back with the card slot. You have the front with the card slot, and then you have the center compartment. And this is now done. Okay, one last thing before I go. I realized I was doing it wrong. The way that I do it is I add a clip to the pinched corners. So if you want to kind of train this to stay in place, you can heat it up like so, and then add your clip to the pinch corner. I was trying to add it to the outer corner, which is why it wasn't working, because it's way too thick in the outer corner. But yeah, so you would just leave that there. You can even close it and just leave it there and kind of let it train itself to stay that way. So yeah, that is the last thing, and now your wallet is done. So yes, that is how you make your very own money pouch wallet, and as you can see, it came out beautifully. I love this so much, and these are just really fun and cute little projects to do. And this wallet is a little too big to fit in the pocket, so this is one of those wallets that definitely has to go in a bag. So it has a card slot on the front, the card slot on the back. Now, if you wanted, you could potentially interface the body of this with decovil light. It would make it a little bit more flexible and able to be collapsed, and then it could probably go in the pocket, but even then it would still be really bulky. So I would really recommend that you keep this for a bag. Keep it for going in a bag. But yeah, this is how it came out, and this is also the side gussets, how I was talking about, like folded in on the ends. I love this look versus it just sticking out. I think it just looks a lot cleaner this way. So yeah, this is this money pouch wallet. I really hope that you guys enjoyed the tutorial and was able to follow along really easy. I'm sorry if it was almost too in-depth, but again, I really like to explain well over the top what's going on so that people can understand. So I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial. Please give it a big thumbs up, leave a comment down below, let me know what you think, and I hope to see you guys in my next tutorial or video. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in my next one. Deuces.